All right, can everybody hear me okay? In the back, thumbs up? All right, cool. So, quick show of hands actually. How many people here are familiar with inclusive design as a practice? All right, cool, great. So let's just jump right in. So it's 2017 and responsive design is now table stakes for any project on the web. But sometimes it seems like our process gets in the way of what we're actually trying to do. We seem to be obsessed with checking off boxes. Is there an iPad view? Can you use it in a screen reader? Are we reducing our bounce rate? These are means to an end, but we need to keep the big picture in mind, which is building experiences that work anywhere and for anyone. Inclusive design teaches us that it's more than just these boxes. So, where's the test for holding a screaming toddler while trying to make lunch reservations? Where's the test for looking at the map to the restaurant in the glare of the noonday sun? CSS is often overlooked as something to take advantage of when it comes to doing accessibility work. But it has a lot of potential when viewed through the lens of inclusive design. And assumptions are the antithesis of inclusive design, so let's begin with some level setting. So what is the web? It's many things to many people, but at its core, it's about content. That might sound kind of glib, but so to put it another way, it's about communicating and acting on information. So what is the web? Structurally speaking, this is the ideal. HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, a nice and tidy separation of concerns. However, it is the web, so it's going to be a little weird. Lately, it's begun to feel more like these concerns are starting to blur. That's not necessarily a value judgment. It just is. But it does feel like because of these choices, we're leaving some people out in the cold. So let's set a common understanding to talk about this a little bit more. HTML describes meaning. It describes meaning semantically. It's an ordered hierarchy of content, not an arbitrary stack of divs. I would say this isn't an idealized situation, but unfortunately, that's usually not true in the real world. JavaScript adds behavior. It does not create structure. This might seem like an oversimplification, and you're right, this is a CSS talk. Priority. Remember, at its core, the web is about content, and appearance is just the visual priority of content. So play to their strengths, these three technologies working together make the web accessible. That's one of the founding principles of the web, and honoring it makes compliance easier. So what is compliance? I've always thought it's a little weird that human-centered design is a specialty in our field. We build interfaces for people, so of course you want people to be able to use them. At its core, audit compliance really just is a formalized set of checks that guarantee everyone can operate an interface regardless of ability. But that's baseline. We could do so much more than that. So what is web compliance? Well, responsive design is adapting design to an unknown browser. You don't make an assumption about where it will be accessed. Inclusive design is adapting design to an unknown user. You don't make an assumption about who will be using it. So play to their strengths, these two methodologies working together cast the widest possible net for people. That's important because as more and more services necessary to living everyday life go online, it is vital to make sure everyone can use them. So what is a browser? If your entry point is a desktop, chances are it'll be either Edge or Safari. But then there's also the other popular browsers out there and their mobile counterparts. Mobile is already a very common entry point for the web. Sometimes it's the only option if you're economically disadvantaged. And then there's the newcomers and the slightly less popular, yet still totally legitimate browsers, sorry Opera, and their developer editions. And don't forget that we tend to be Western-centric, but that's rapidly changing. Remember, it's the World Wide Web, not the wealthy Western web. So the point is browsers are impossible to corral, and it might seem a little intimidating, but that's actually a good thing. Different users have different needs, and we don't want to be prescriptive because we can't know all of our users' needs all the time or how they go about satisfying them. Inclusive design embraces that. So what is a browser? Browsers are ubiquitous, but we still don't really think of them that way. When seeing the word browser, typically people think, Google Chrome on a desktop. The way we interact with them changes constantly. This is Lynx, an early text-based browser. That's still out there. You can use it. It's great. Browsers can also use a lot of different interaction modes. Here's a screen reader that can display all the links on a page as an ordered list. And browsers might be on platforms you might not be immediately thinking of. The Sony PlayStation ships with one built in. We tend to make assumptions about nearly every aspect of our audience. Here's a LeapPad, a tablet targeted towards kids. We also make assumptions based on price. Here's a $30 touchscreen smartphone with a color display and a camera. And here's a Kindle, a luxury device with a slow monochromatic display. We also assume that devices will come through traditional channels and be used as intended. Here's a chip, a full-color touch display computer with a non-standard screen size that can get a browser hacked onto it in minutes. I know this, I've done it, it's awesome. You should buy one, they're fun. And here's an oscilloscope that runs Internet Explorer. Yeah. We also tend to assume a lot about form factor. It's a fridge, and yes, it's real. You can go buy it right now. I wouldn't recommend it. It's in a mobile, low-power browser with a long product lifespan, so it's going to be in your house for a good long time. And we don't know what the future will be like. The web itself was a surprise. Think about how much has changed in the last 20 years. Do you know where it'll be in the next 20? It could be your car's windshield. It could be your contact lenses. It could be your bedroom wallpaper. I guarantee you, whatever that shape it takes, there's going to be some sort of browser involved in that future. The web isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So by making things as robust as possible in the present, you're making them adaptable, which is great for weathering the seas of change. This is embracing inclusive design in the short term to do the heavy lifting for us in the long term. So how does CSS fit in all this? After all, this is a talk about media queries. Well, that depends on how you talk about it. So writing the correct CSS once is pretty easy. Making that CSS work in all situations and for all people is the hard part. That's a quote from Micah Godbolt. He's the senior design developer at Microsoft. For me, working in all situations and for all people falls into the domain of media queries. So how do I talk about media queries? Media queries describe meaning and context. So close your eyes for a second and imagine that you're in a dark room with some friends and there's an elephant in it. Reach out and touch it and describe what you're experiencing. It's a friendly elephant, don't worry, he's not going to trample you. The tusks feel like spears. The trunk feels like a snake. The tail feels like rope. The legs feel like wooden stumps. The skin feels like concrete. That's kind of how I think about media queries. You have this platonic ideal of a site floating out there in the ether with different browsers describing what it is from their perspective. You can open your eyes now if you haven't done it already. Thank you. As a consultant, I see a few repeated patterns when working with other people's CSS. That usually boils down to blindly copying and pasting without knowing the full potential of the technology. Another tell are libraries that make writing media queries easier, but the expense of leaving features out. And that's not necessarily a value judgment. That's just what it is. People have deadlines, and hey, if it works, it works. Hopefully, however, I can give you a few more tricks to share with your team. So the absence of media support for media queries is, in fact, the first media query. That's a quote from Brian Rieger's landmark Rethinking the Web talk. So what you want here are sensible defaults to accommodate the unknown. Good design practices such as larger type and comfortable line height and width to accommodate concerns such as farsightedness and dyslexia. Good affordances for interactive areas for motor control issues such as Parkinson's or arthritis. And a clear hierarchy of content and chunking of information for cognitive concerns such as reading level. Cognitive concerns are worth discussing a little bit in detail here. We tend to think of disabilities as people in wheelchairs, but the vast majority of disability issues are actually cognitive. This is on authority from the World Health Organization, and their reports outline depression as one of the most significant forms of cognitive impairment. This isn't assumptions about English as a second language or lack of public schooling. This is a widespread genetic and environmental issue that affects the entire planet. Depression can stunt things like learning and application of knowledge, but we barely ever discuss it because of the social stigmas. Personally, I'm willing to admit suffering from it. And since getting treatment, I've definitely experienced better problem-solving capabilities. This talk is actually a product of that process. So, go CSS. So when you go to write your content and your technical documentation, it's good to keep this in mind. And all right, that was a little heavy, so let's actually go to media query support. So when any device's viewport reaches a minimum width of 30 ems, do the following. This is what we want to do. So how do we get there? Here's the syntax. When the media rule keyword of @media is present and the minimum width of 30 ems media feature occurs, apply these selectors and declarations. So why M's? They accommodate the widest swath of browsers. Most importantly, since they are based on type size, they elegantly and dynamically accommodate browser zoom. A lot of exhaustive research has been done on this, and your pixel value use case isn't as clever as you think it is, and REMs fall apart in some really obscure edge cases. M's have great support and always have, so trust me, use M's. Use M's, please. Thank you. So now let's up the complexity a little. When a device with a screen's viewport reaches a minimum width of 30 M's, do the following. So how do we get there? With a media type of screen and a minimum width of 30 M's, apply these selectors and declarations. The media type is a subtle but important distinction. It targets screens. So what other media types are out there? So here's all the types listed in the documentation. All targets all media types devices. RL targets speech and sound synthesizers. Braille targets Braille tactical feedback devices. Emboss targets paged Braille printers. Handheld targets smaller handheld devices. Print targets printers. Projection targets projections. Voila. Screen targets computer screens. Speech targets speech synthesizers. TTY targets tel types and terminals. Who here remembers tel type? Yep. Okay, you're from England probably. And TV targets TV. Who here has a TV? Yeah, cool. Okay. So, you know, it's the web, however, so things aren't going to be easy. Only all print, screen, and speech have wide enough support to be used with confidence. Of those four, speech is tricky because of two things. One, screen readers don't always communicate their presence to the browser. And two, the lack of any real support for RL CSS properties. Yes, it exists, and yes, it would be awesome if we could use it. It's a spec that intends to tell a digitized voice how it should read content, the same way regular CSS tells the browsers how to visually display this content. This is good for screen readers, but don't forget that digital assistants are very popular now. Print is often overlooked, but more people print web pages than you may initially think. CSS features like before and after pseudo elements let us create meaningful artifacts like printed URLs for links, and declarations and descriptions of the main takeaway for interactive visualizations. I've even seen QR codes for long, difficult to type URLs that pre-configure queries or application state, which goes to show that a little consideration can go a long way UX-wise. Another interesting thing I'd like to point out here, handheld projection and TV have all been deprecated because, you know, what's a TV and what's a projector? You know, good inclusive design principles obviates the need for these distinctions. If your color contrast, ratio, and type size are proper, you don't have to worry about a special theme that targets a projector display. Another thing I'd like to point out is the all media type. A lot of browsers will default to using this if you don't explicitly state a media type. And this can get you into trouble with the unintended consequences of the cascade. That's a mouthful. It's better to get into the habit of declaring screen when you make visual edits. So yeah, let's talk media features. The background from this slide is from one of my favorite scenes from a movie ever. The Blues Brothers ask the bartender of a backwater bar what kind of music they usually play. And she answers, oh, we got both kinds. We got country and Western. And that's kind of how I feel about media features. In addition to browser height and width, we have 8 other media features available to work with. So height determines the height of the target media, width determines the width of the target media. Aspect ratio determines the ratio between the viewport's height and width. Color determines the presence of color. Color index determines the number of entries in the color lookup tables. Grid determines if this is a grid device, such as a terminal. Monochrome determines the shades of a single color. Orientation determines if it's held in landscape or portrait orientation. Resolution determines the device's display density, how much DPI it can support or has. Scan determines the type of scanning process used, progressive versus NTC for people that know that crazy European format. These are important. They allow us to really dig into the capabilities of the device, the quality of its screen, its physical orientation in space, how it handles color. However, a lot of the time in these lists, you will also see these 3 deprecated features: device aspect ratio, device height, and device width. Simply put, don't use them. Remember, it's near impossible to know what a device is, but we can react to how the device behaves. Like programming languages, media queries also have logic. It's pretty basic, but you can do some powerful stuff in the right hands. The @media declaration itself is an if statement. If the browser supports an @media, do something. You can chain with and, so you can target screens with both a minimum height of 20 ems and a minimum width of 30 ems, or allows you to apply this or that, target anything with a max width of 10 ems or a minimum width of 20 ems, but nothing in between. And you could exclude with not. Target anything with a max width display of 10 ems that isn't monochrome. So why is all this so great? With good namespacing discipline, you can adapt your content to best fit the device it will be consumed on without knowing specifically what that device is. Use media queries to write small surgical tweaks that enhance the class and not the page the class is placed on. Here, the theme for a background can safely remove images from devices that would break if they tried to display them, and remove backgrounds from media that would choke on rendering them. People still use grid displays and print web pages, and not for the reasons you'd initially think. For example, I've got a terminal powered by WebKit on my computer right now, and slide notes down here in case things go really pear-shaped. So armed with these expanded capabilities, how do we go about best using them? So first, set your breakpoints based on ergonomics, not devices. Think about how we position ourselves around our devices, and remember that you don't always have hands to do it. Positioning is a good baseline for setting type. Ask yourself, is the type sufficiently large enough to read when you hold your device in your palm, or on your lap, or when you're sitting at a desk, or when you're across the room? In fact, take a moment to think about how you're viewing this presentation right now. Type is the cornerstone of any interface. Once you have that established, you can build outwards with confidence. With regards to media queries, a very smart guy called Brad Foss advises us to not go overboard, to treat layout as an enhancement, and to let content determine breakpoints. Remember to think not in terms of audience, but in terms of people. People aren't always going to be on a WebKit browser or a Windows machine, but they will be reading the web. Don't target common device screen sizes. Even if your analytics guy wants you to do it, you have people that use iPads, not iPad users, and that's a subtle yet important distinction. I'd also like to point out another @rule, supports. Although it's not technically a media query, it is very much in keeping with the spirit of this presentation. Supports allows us to construct what is known as a feature query, which lets you adjust the interface based on what level of compliance the browser has for modern CSS features. That ensures that everyone gets a high quality experience regardless of device. In this example, the site's text would contrast fallback that would have otherwise been illegible when rendered by a browser that does not support background blend modes, which is perfect for those gradient loaded full page hero screens that seem to be so in vogue these days. Speaking of namespacing, components make things easier to manage. If you're using a CSS preprocessor, you can include the media query inside of the component partial, and it will export it as valid CSS. This helps make robust components and makes your code easier to understand. Remember, inclusive design principles can extend to code. Minifiers will organize and optimize the NCSS. Let robots mind the kind of things that robots are good at minding. For example, CSS Nano, the CSS Nano part of the process maintains the semantics of the style sheet you pass through it, but does stuff like removing redundant properties and leading zeros and standardizing the kind of quotes used. This makes things incredibly friendly for server-side compression, and these micro optimizations ultimately assist low bandwidth users by creating the smallest possible download package. This is good for everyone: developing countries, rural areas, people with metered data plans, people on the bus, train or conference Wi-Fi, and people with Comcast, which is basically all of Boston. So yeah, now on to the obscure stuff. High contrast mode is a setting that makes interfaces legible for people experiencing low vision. On this example, the logo on the Boston Globe is not visually apparent when high contrast mode is enabled. This is bad because logos that link home are a common affordance people use to navigate. Remember that high contrast doesn't always mean low vision disorder is present either. Pro tip, max brightness and high contrast mode enabled allows you to use your laptop in the garden. Looks ugly but functional. Ugly but functional would make a great tattoo, by the way. That's advice some guy on Twitter is sharing on how to use a computer when harsh glare is present. He's not a specialist or an industry rock star. He's just some guy on Twitter making technology work for him and not the other way around. The high contrast mode media query only works in Edge on Windows for now. In the example, we're telling the SVG icon in a button to match the color of the button label, whatever the label color might be set to. I'm saying set to because Windows high contrast colors are mapped to CSS system color keywords. CSS system color was an old idea that you could kind of lock into the operating system and use the colors it uses. It had some security problems. Nevertheless, this is still supported. This is important because Windows allows you to create custom high contrast themes, so these colors could hypothetically be anything. Here's a mapping of the content types and the relevant keywords that will allow you to work with high contrast mode best. Text is window text, links is just an A tag, selected text is highlight text and highlight, button label is button face, background is window. This is really limited and it's on purpose. You know, when you have a high contrast mode presentation, you really want to focus on the content and not the aesthetic trappings. Reduce motion, what is that? Well, it's exactly what it says it is. It allows you to target users who have explicitly stated a preference for less motion in the UI animation. This is great for people with vestibular disorders or ADHD, or for people like me, you know, impatient curmudgeons, just don't have time for watching the gratuitous UI animation on an app over and over and over again. This media query only works on Safari on macOS and iOS, and only when reduced motion is enabled in the operating system preferences. In the example, we're removing animation from a large background, but we could also slow it down or simplify things if the use case requires the animation in order to convey critical information. Like high contrast mode, these tweaks are there for those who need them to make the experience work regardless of circumstance. Yeah, not a lot of people are aware of these two features, but that doesn't mean we should ignore using them because of it. You might be in a situation where you're not seeing the personal benefit, or you are, but your boss might not see the business case. It's important to remember that disabilities are more than just screen reader support. They're a spectrum of concerns, and inclusive design teaches us that disabilities can be conditional. Harsh glare, a fever, a broken arm, not knowing the native language, or just getting older. Unfortunately, as much as we might want to pretend technology does not exist in a vacuum, we also live in an age where people can and will use disability triggers as attack vectors, such as deliberately sending a journalist with epilepsy seizure-inducing tweets. This year, the current administration has been stripping government protections, but with the recent Winn-Dixie lawsuit, it's created precedents for private individuals successfully suing private companies for lack of access. And this is huge, as it no longer takes a large organizational momentum, such as needing the National Foundation for the Blind to intervene in people's ability to live their lives. So I guess the takeaway here is advocate for your future self, and in doing so, advocate for others. Okay, let's talk about the future. The writing is on the wall, and by wall, I mean the specs. It's feature queries. Feature queries are media queries for user preference. Existing media queries have display on lockdown, so now it's all about letting our users tell us what they want and responding to it. We have had a taste of this with the last two examples, so let's see what's coming down the pike. Color gamut allows you to manipulate images based on the color profile of the display, but inclusive design concerns really should be handled with proper contrast ratios, not gamut shenanigans. If you're using images to communicate large amounts of critical information, you'll honestly probably want to rethink your content strategy. I'm including this for the sake of completeness, but I'm sure someone more clever than me will figure out something cool to do with it. Interaction covers the new pointer and hover media features, which go together like chimpanzees and tuxedos. These two features can adjust the display based on how we can interact with the device. Pointer reacts to the accuracy of the device's primary form of input. So you have a coarse, fine, or no point support present. It's important to note primary here as the operative word, since there are devices that can accept multiple forms of input. Here's a Microsoft Surface. It's a device with a touchscreen, a trackpad, a stylus, and a wireless mouse. Just to have all the bases covered. And keep that sort of thing in mind when you start messing with things like clickable areas. Remember that individuals with motor control issues may augment their devices with specialized pointing tools, and the presence of these tools may not be communicated to the underlying hardware. And it's just easier to work with a cascade and create sensible defaults from the get-go. Hover capability is also determined by the device's primary input mechanism. We have no hover support, regular hovering support like you're used to with a mouse, or on-demand where, like iOS, you can long press to simulate a hover effect. As a rule, I don't like interfaces that utilize hover to expose functionality. It's a throwback from a desktop and mouse-centric era, and in addition to problems with discoverability, it is also an issue for people with motor control, to say nothing about technological literacy concerns. It's also a pretty big obstacle if you're navigating via switch control, which is using a page scan to enable devices, usually via a head-controlled device. And I think it's also worth mentioning here that small devices aren't always lacking hover capability, and the opposite also applies. Large devices might not have hover capability either. Now, iPad Pros, anyone? All right, so now let's talk about media queries that speak to the display itself. Display mode allows us to change things based on how the browser itself is presented. As progressive web apps become more popular, this becomes more important. The inclusive design angle here is a low bandwidth battle for the home screen one, where web apps can behave like native apps while still being open and interoperable. The web is becoming a first-class citizen for mobile OSs, which is huge because the accessibility of Android apps stinks. And HTML as a format is far more accommodating to assistive tech. Update checks how quickly the device is able to modify the appearance of content. Here, slow, fast, or none. This one is pretty straightforward. You're able to more granularly craft appearances for e-ink or lower power devices. So a gentleman by the name of Andres Gallant wrote a great article for CSS Tricks about putting them all together. So you have mobile, small, portrait, slow, interlace, monochrome, coarse, non-hover first. Mobile first was a great starting point when we were first figuring out what responsive design was. But in our everything has a browser now world, this update provides a rock-solid, future-friendly foundation to build from. Light level uses the device's sensors to determine how bright the environment is. This media query makes me feel old because we now assume that the majority of devices will ship with some sort of camera built into it. There are three options for light level: normal, dim, and washed. This is cool because washed has been discussed as a supplement for high contrast mode. And remember, with media query logic, we can lump the two together and not have to write redundant code. Let's note that normal lighting is rated to what the manufacturer describes as ideal for the screen. But since these technologies are interoperable, there is also the potential to override them, say with a system-wide preference toggle or a browser extension. Scripting allows us to target JavaScript or lack thereof. There are three values: enabled, none, and initial. Enabled is if the user can support JavaScript, while none is if they have it disabled or it fails to load. Remember, even though we live in the age of monolithic JavaScript frameworks, every user technically does not have JavaScript until they do. This might get me some subtweets from people with fancy Twitter bios, but I kind of feel the larger the JS payload, the larger the chance of failure. So if you're thinking this smells like an argument for progressive enhancement, you're right. So initial only indicates that scripting is enabled during the initial page load, but is not supported afterwards. Examples are printed pages or pre-rendering network proxies that render a page on a server and send a nearly static version of the page to the user. That is a nice and succinct example from the W3C spec. They're really good on brevity. So it's a little tricky. The authors are still trying to figure out what the difference is between a server-rendered page and a page with deferred loading JavaScript. I think these are champagne problems. Personally, performant web pages are oftentimes also accessible web pages. For example, Lighthouse, Google's progressive web app analyzer, uses an accessibility audit as a primary scoring metric. Inverted colors are the poor man's high contrast mode. Most operating systems can do it. I use it a lot when browsing on my phone at night. And again, you can chain it using the logic described earlier. It's worth mentioning that Chrome has an extension for it, which is a good reminder that you shouldn't be in the business of trying to do device sniffing, especially for assistive technology. A practical application of this would be the double inversion technique, where you invert inverted multimedia. It's simple, it's powerful, and it ensures content remains legible regardless of what mode it is being viewed in. Our old friend reduced motion is also listed, so all that work you did for Apple devices, guess what? It'll be available to everyone. And finally, we have custom media queries. This one is a little weird to wrap your head around, so bear with me here. If you weren't already aware, CSS is getting support for a special syntax called custom properties. These special properties are variables that are declared in the root selector to give them global scope, the root selector here being the equivalent to the HTML tag selector. They are key value pairs that print out whatever string you have defined. Here, I've been using them to do some really simple theming work. You with me so far? Yeah? All right, cool. The cool thing about CSS custom properties is that, unlike preprocessor variables, they are accessible via JavaScript on the live site. Previously, to send data from CSS to JavaScript, we often had to resort to hacks like writing CSS values in plain JSON, and CSS output, and then parsing it in JavaScript, which is gross and nasty and weird and cumbersome. But now, once you've got the CSS styles targeted in JavaScript, you can manipulate them. Here, I'm switching the values for the primary and secondary brand colors. And you can take it one step further and work that logic into dynamic components. This button toggles inverting the site's theme. It's a simple example, but hopefully it makes sense. So in the same vein, you'll soon be able to declare custom media query properties. They're functionally the same, an author-defined custom string, only this time you're using the @custom_media declaration to create them. Like CSS custom properties, you can use them in the site CSS. The easy win here is a set once and update everywhere approach. But don't forget that you can manipulate them with JavaScript. And I'll admit, this amount of power is potentially very intimidating, but I also think there's a lot of potential for being future-friendly here. We're leaving the doors wide open to accommodate the unknown. And a lot of that could be interfacing with assistive technology we can't even dream of yet. In fact, I came across this tweet on my way over. It uses custom properties to elegantly control reduced motion. How cool is that? So there's going to be a lot of wonderful things written by brilliant people that we'll be seeing in the coming years. And I can't wait to use them. By day, I'm a consultant for a digital design and development agency called Cantina, and we're hiring if you want to work with me and have me harass you about accessibility all day. So if that's interesting to you, come find me and give me your contact info after this talk. I know I covered a lot of the material, so here's how to reach me if you have any follow-up questions. I'll also be posting slides with links to the resources I used to develop this talk if you want references to pull out at a later date. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, and thanks to Amanda and Meg for this wonderful speaking opportunity. I'm done. Oh, right, yeah. Also, Amanda reminded me that I host a bi-monthly CodePen meetup at Cantina. For those of you who aren't aware, CodePen is basically an online CSS, HTML, JavaScript development tool with great community support, and Amanda is actually giving a talk on it, so you should definitely go see her talk. What are we talking about?
Hello.
What?
I'm going to be giving a talk about P5, which is a JavaScript implementation of processing, and it's going to be using examples of CodePens that I built for, how do I phrase this? Like contemporary art implementations on CodePen. Yes, I went to school for fine arts and painting.
Yeah. The other thing there is we have a hack session after the presentation, so all the things you discuss, we get to kind of break out and try out and then come together and show it. Yeah?
Cantina is like, we're here in Boston, we're helping support so we're nearby.
He's my coworker.
Is Cantina hiring
Yes. Darn.
or anything?
Oh, it's general. Yeah. Wow, I'm really good at promotion. It's a general application, and I believe we're also looking for a senior mobile developer. So iOS, Android. No longer the Windows Phone. Rest in peace. And that's it. I think. Is that it?
That's it.
All right. That's it.
So we're going to hang around here for a little bit, so feel free to stay and chat with us. Does anyone have announcements for events or anyone hiring or looking to be hired that wants to make an announcement? Is that nobody? Okay, well, I'm looking. What did you say?
Questions about the presentation?
Questions about the presentation?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
What are you gonna do with those web dev wallpapers?
With what?
The web bedroom wallpapers.
Web dev.
Bedroom,
Wallpaper in your bedroom.
Oh yeah. You know, I personally have always wanted like a giant e-ink display, so that would be cool. And like, you know, how many people here watch Netflix in bed? Yeah, yeah. Like 12K or whatever it is by then. Yes.
So you didn't mention about Aria. So who do you see Aria going as a design changes towards something more inclusive?
So the question is, where do I see ARIA going? So for people that aren't aware, ARIA is a supplemental kind of quasi-language to the HTML spec. It introduces properties that are designed to interface with assistive technology, namely screen readers. They're used to describe functional state. So when a device displays a banner to alert you that something has happened, it's a good way to kind of programmatically communicate that. So ARIA is a little bit tricky in that it's got a complicated history of support, and also a lot of people aren't aware it exists. However, I think it's really cool because accessibility is becoming more in vogue, and with that, the practice of inclusive design. So I'm not necessarily saying it's on the onus of designers to be aware of these features, but if you're a good doobie, you'll do your homework, and when you introduce a design that has these considerations, you might be able to communicate to a developer like, oh, have you considered these properties? And then the developer can turn around and says, there's no support for this, what are you doing? I hope that browsers get better at support implementation. I know it's cool to hate on Microsoft, but Edge has been very responsive in terms of implementing new features, and of that, a lot of kind of weird accessibility niche fixes. So I'm cautiously optimistic. And if you're not familiar with ARIA, go learn about ARIA. It's awesome. Yes?
So in terms of integrating accessibility into your site, it takes up more hours to implement this. So at the beginning of the project, how do you encourage whoever is scoping and budgeting this project to actually include enough time and budget to do this right?
Yeah, so the question is
You run into issues with that.
scoping and budgeting and how you introduce these things into the site. I don't have an answer for you. It's an evergreen problem. It's a highly contextual problem. It depends on the size of your organization and what the priorities are. Also, if you are bound by the still legally binding 508 criteria, or if you are afraid of getting sued and are a brave new frontier of lawsuits, I would like to think that people are good people, and of course you're going to consider and implement these things, but you can play bad cop and phrase it in terms of risk. A lot of the times, I think people aren't even aware, the decision makers aren't even aware of these concerns or the possibility of these lawsuits. So if you're going to institute a culture of accessibility at an organization, I think it's better to not be adversarial about it. It's hard to say like, oh, hey, by the way, two of my favorite tricks are maintenance sprints. If your organization practices that, what's the tweet? It's like 9% of the world still uses Internet Explorer, and we spend so many hours doing IE compliance. But if you compare that to the number of people that have disabilities, like it's a drop in the bucket. So like kind of changing your thinking around that. The other argument is like if you think you don't have the budget for accessibility fixes, like imagine what your budget's going to be when you get sued. Yeah.
Do you know of anyone who's published some boilerplate or a framework to get the low-hanging fruit of accessibility, something like the bootstrap of accessibility that people could just slap in there and hit a big chunk of it?
Yeah, Bootstrap's weird. I have personal issues with Bootstrap. It was very idealistic, and in doing so, created a lot of markup problems. My answer to your question is the HTML5 boilerplate is written by some very good people, and out of the box is fully compliant as far as I understand, but it's not very opinionated about how you structure and style things. You can search for like WordPress themes that have it as a consideration. WordPress itself has been doubling down on support, so anything that they recommend, I think they have a tag for it in their themes, I'm not sure. But the best way I found to kind of mind this sort of thing is if you're doing continuous integration, to set up an automated accessibility checker like Tenon or Axe. If you're not doing continuous integration, there are browser plugins. So every time you push to the server, just before you do that, run it through a tester and see what it screams at. Pally is another good one. It works on the terminal. You can set it up, write an alias, and fire it off, and it'll yell at you, and you feel bad, and then you fix it, and you feel good. But I guess the other kind of thing is like compliance work isn't binary, and manual testing is going to reveal things that even things that are guaranteed to be accessible may not actually deliver on in terms of actual when you take it and work with it. And like some of the low-hanging fruit there are, alt tags for images. Every CMS under the sun supports them. And if they don't, get a new CMS. It's nothing worse than a bad CMS. And then the other thing is like heading order, and then color contrast ratios. And those are things that are usually author defined and author controlled. So to answer your question in a long and roundabout way, no. Yes.
Yeah, actually, you kind of dovetailed right into the question I had. Is, do you have any resources where you can actually simulate like these browsers of where you can simulate a screen reader or a braille reader? It's like you were saying, you get an automated test, or you do this low-hanging fruit. You don't actually necessarily know how the user's going to experience that. So is there any place that where you can simulate that and actually experience what it's like to do your own website for these tools?
Yes, sort of. So again, we don't want to tokenize these experiences, but I appreciate the sentiment of the question, which is, using it as an empathy and like due diligence building tool. So like that being said, both Windows and Mac ship with screen readers built in. There's a third screen reader called NVDA, which is free and is on Windows. Windows itself offers a virtual machine for free for developer use with Edge, but you can install whatever the heck you want on it. What else was I going to say? Their browser stack gets you the normal browsers. But if you're gonna test a screen reader, test a screen reader. So just throw NVDA on, and then I would also say that it's almost a QA concern at that point. We have a large client that integrated it into their QA testing process, and for them, it's the same as if I click the button, does a thing pop up? Cool, yes. If I click the button with a keyboard, does a thing pop up? No, okay, we have a problem here. In terms of simulation, and I can do a link dump after on the meetup page, but there's a few things. There's the No Coffee browser extension, which can emulate kind of sort of a lot of low vision disorders. So certain kinds of color blindness, like detached retinas, all that good stuff. Wow, no pressure. I not to self-promote, but I guess I'm going to do it. I released a website this year called empathyprompts.net, I believe, that has a series of kind of empathy building exercises that link to other kind of resources, and then like also kind of social prompts, like, can you use your website if you're sitting on your dominant hand, or it's a touch display. So like, is your motor control good enough? And I'm drawing a blank. I can spam the meetup page with links, as many as you're willing to look at.
Okay. So how do you look at versus usability of the website?
So I hate trend. I hate trendy. Usability is king. But I kind of double dip into the designer and developer roles, and if you really truly do care about these concerns, you can find something that is aesthetically pleasing and also functional. It's really cool to see accessibility come in vogue recently, because we're kind of using it as a vanity metric, and that's fine because I'll take what I can get. But designers and developers are becoming aware that this is a thing that exists, whereas historically it was kind of like delegated to this dark corner of government compliance for government contractors who just, their marching orders were to get it to work and, oh God, please don't let them sue us. Whereas now, people that are capable of integrating these two desires are starting to do that. Marcy Sutton, who is a very, very, very cool lady, she runs a Tumblr called Accessibility Wins. And one of the cool things she does is she showcases things that are both beautiful and functional. And I'm kind of blanking on what currently has been exhibited, but they're effectively they're sites that, had you not known that they were fully compliant, you wouldn't know, which is kind of the ideal situation. Yes?
Marcy also has some, I think it's free on Egghead, some intro to accessibility, or how to solve some low-hanging fruit issues on your site, some lessons on it.
Yes, yeah, just to repeat that with a louder voice. Marcy has a series on egghead.io for free for basic accessibility kind of crash course. What was I going to say there? Yeah, they're quick, they're bite-sized, they're not really that scary. They're really cool. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
Yeah, besides that, do you have any other good examples of apps or websites that have good accessibility?
Yeah, there's Deek Systems, which makes the Axe browser extension. And one of the cool things that they just published last month is a style guide that they use, a living style guide that has every kind of major browser UI feature that you'd ever want, to the point of Bootstrap. Like, I need a combo box, I'm going to get a combo box. I need a select box, I'm going to do a select box. And the cool thing about this is, again, it's another example of if you didn't know, you wouldn't know. So they're styled to look like kind of common web UI, but if you hit them with a screen reader, not only are they functional, but they're elegantly functional in that the UX for screen reader support is great. In terms of, again, to kind of mine that accessible versus inclusive thing, any site that comes out that basically you can read outside on an iPad, it's a really important thing to stress. Low vision, like, everybody loves to ignore it, but like, how many people here are wearing glasses? And I can see if you're lying. That's a low vision condition. You're going to get older, your vision's going to fail. You might use a screen magnifier. These are the kinds of things that to me are accessible, and less like, here's this museum of catering to a specific demographic. Yes.
Two things. One, for the question earlier about how do you leverage the financial justification.
Yep.
If you're selling into higher education, they were some of the first ones with big lawsuits.
Oh, yes.
And the universities are passing that on to their vendors. And a lot of people just don't know about it yet because maybe there's a smaller fish in the chain. But that's a big lever to financial justification. The second is anybody who has not actually seen a blind person or physically impaired person or anything actually navigate a website, especially your own, arrange it if possible. It is absolutely mind-blowingly eye-opening.
That's a really good point. Wow. I feel bad I didn't think of that. So we're right near the School for the Blind, and they actually have outreach programs where you can go do this, and it's cool and great, and they like it, and it's not like, frankly, it's not like going to a zoo to see this disabled person do a thing. It's more like an outreach program where people self-select to do this. The other thing is, like, these kinds of demos are on YouTube, so if you don't want to interact with other people and watch it in the comfort of your own, laptop in bed, you can watch people do it, and it's really, to your point, it's crazy to watch them navigate because they have the same behaviors that sighted users will do, which is like, I'm going to hit this page. If I don't see what I'm looking for, I'm out. And like, again, that's just basic web design, which is prioritize your content, get it up front. Otherwise, don't waste my time. I'm done. Okay, any other questions? Cool, thank you very much.
Thank you. So does anyone have announcements now? I'm gonna make one for myself. I'm looking for fully remote work, HTML and CSS stuff. So if you want to come talk to me, here. All right, so feel free to stick around. We will stick around for at least another half hour or so.
I feel a little silly because actually Cantina hosts my meetup, so I feel like I'm just plugging all over the place, but it's okay. You give me the food. So. My name is Rose Williams. I run the Write the Docs meetup in the Boston area. If you're unfamiliar with Write the Docs, we are a meetup that prioritizes technical communication, which actually goes into a lot of accessibility issues. Labeling your buttons is really important, especially for things like standard readers. Which we've done some talks actually that was how we got in with Cantina. We did an accessibility talk for user error messages. So we actually don't have a meetup until September, but if you're someone who deals with technical communication, you should probably reach out and attend because we're really cool. We have really good food because Cantina does nice things for us. So.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes. We got grilled cheese and tater tots. So I don't know if anyone else is into that, but like some heavy nostalgia came back at that moment. Just like some middle school stuff right there. But it's good. Our next one will actually be with Sarah Schneider, and she'll be talking about Git. If you're unfamiliar with technical writers, a lot of us don't use Git a lot of the time. So we're going to do a quick intro course into using Git. But we'll have some other cool stuff coming for next year. I actually already have a year's worth of content. So look forward to that.
That's all.